Hello, welcome back to another episode of JayDHD's Writing Lessons. We are going to be talking about ADHD and writing. I am still not a doctor, I've not got that medical license since last week, so if you want some actual medically sanctioned information on ADHD, I'll be leaving links to a couple of organizations in the description. Also, this episode we're going to be discussing anxiety and rejection-sensitive dysphoria a little bit. So if that could be upsetting to you, or if at any point you're stressed out by this video, I'd just recommend clicking off and doing something to look after yourself. And also I'll be leaving links to some mental health charities in the description if you need more urgent help. Without further ado, let's get on with the video. This week we're talking about editing. I'm going to take you through 3 different kinds of editing, why people with ADHD might find them difficult, and some strategies that should hopefully help make them a little bit easier for you. First up, copy editing. This is editing for the itty-bitty details like spelling errors and punctuation errors and grammar errors and other types of little errors. This is probably the type of editing that I struggle the most with. I remember the first time I submitted an assignment for my degree, it came back with 5 comments in a row, all on one paragraph that just said apostrophe. I thought maybe this was some kind of like error on the part of the marker or like the software crashing, but no, it turned out I literally just misused apostrophes 5 times in a row. I think the big reason that I find proofreading so difficult is because it's just boring. You know, the ADHD brain tends to despise anything that it doesn't find interesting. So unless you have some kind of hyperfixation on punctuation, in which case you have godlike powers and I fear you deeply, and maybe we could do some kind of hyperfixation trade at some point, hit me up in the comments. But unless you have that, you're probably going to struggle to proofread. Even if I can get myself to sit down and try and proofread, I always just end up skim reading and missing half of the typos. If I have a day when my meds are working particularly well, I might be able to read a bit more thoroughly, but I can only really do about 2 or 3 paragraphs before I just get brain foggy. Work that's particularly detail focused can be difficult for people with ADHD, so even if you can get yourself to do it, it can just be incredibly tiring. Given all of that, my #1 piece of proofreading advice is get someone else to proofread for you. Seriously, even neurotypical people need someone else to look over their work. When you write something yourself, your brain just becomes very familiar with it, and when you're reading back, you'll naturally start to skip over a lot of the typos. So a fresh set of eyes will always pick up errors that the original writer can't. I have my mum proofread my essays, and at uni we have group workshops where we feedback on each other's stuff, and a pretty big part of that is catching each other's typos. As an addendum to that, having spell check on is not the same as having someone look over your work. There's stuff that spell check just doesn't catch. I had spell check on during my 5 wrong apostrophes in a row debacle, but I didn't have an actual human being read that paragraph. I believe that there are people online who you can pay to proofread your work, or if you have a writer friend, you can offer to proofread each other's. If proofreading isn't your strong suit, then you can offer some other writing related service or just pay them in soup. My editor is currently working on an all-soup salary and doesn't seem to mind. Now let's zoom out a bit to line editing. This is editing for things like, how does this sentence look? Is this line of dialogue in character? Are there too many geese in this metaphor? Editing for things like word choice, sentence structure and style, rather than typos or wrong apostrophe number 6. This is a task that I actually do enjoy once I've started, but for some reason I've convinced myself every single time that it's going to be miserable and I never want to actually start doing it. One of the reasons that this can be difficult for people with ADHD is because one of the most common pieces of line editing advice is to take some time away from the piece you want to edit and not look at it for a couple of days or even weeks and months, so that when you come back to edit, you have kind of a fresh perspective on it and you're a lot less close to the piece. I'm not saying that this is bad advice, it's actually really good advice that I do my best to follow in my own practice. I mentioned this earlier, but when you wrote something yourself, you get very familiar with it, and when you read back, you start to skip over a lot of the details. And the best way to counteract this is to defamiliarize yourself with it by taking some time away. The reason that this can be challenging for people with ADHD is because if I take 2 weeks away from a project, the odds of me actually remembering to come back and edit it are low, to say the least. If I don't just forget that it exists entirely, I will probably put off returning to it indefinitely, because I mentioned before that my brain is convinced that line editing is a horrible, horrible task, even though I actually do enjoy it most of the time. It can be easier to come back to the work if it's something that you have a deadline for, because that way you know you have to come back and look at it. But in order for that to work, you need to have a draft prepared in advance enough of the deadline to give you time to take a couple of days away and not look at it and then come back to edit, the odds of which are also low. Well, this is a conundrum that I'm still struggling with. I do have some suggestions that might help you. You can always set an alarm to remind you to go back and do your copy editing, though my success with alarms has been mixed. You can always put an alarm on snooze, you know. A strategy that I found more effective is to edit in chunks rather than finishing a draft and leaving all the editing to the end. For instance, you could try, say, every day at the start of your writing, you go back to some pages that you wrote a week ago and edit those. This way, you're keeping momentum with the project, breaking the task into smaller chunks, and getting space from what you've written all at once. You can experiment with different ways of doing this. I actually find it difficult to handle 2 different tasks in one day, so I'm going to try having a dedicated line editing day every week. Like I said, this is still something that I'm personally struggling with, so if any of you guys have any suggestions, feel free to leave them down in the comments. Now we zoom out to structural edits. This kind of editing is concerned with things like the order that events happen in, and are your character arcs complete and cohesive. You're editing the bones of the story here. Explaining why this is difficult is actually pretty simple. It's just a lot of stuff to hold in your brain. Especially if we're talking about a big project like a novel where you have multiple characters and plot lines, it's just a lot of information that you have to balance. Just a small disclaimer, I absolutely love this stage of writing, so I'm sorry if this advice only works if you just naturally find plot structure fun. I've been thinking about making some more videos on plot structure in the future, specifically how to get good at it without just spending hours and hours reading up on the hero's journey. So just let me know in the comments if you want to watch me lose my mind about structure for 20 minutes. Anyway, back to the topic at hand. In my opinion, the best way to handle structural edits is with reverse outlining. This is something that I talked about a little bit last week, but I worry that I skimmed in a couple of places, so I wanted to go over it in a little bit more depth here. Just to demonstrate my points, I'm going to be using the story Jack and the Beanstalk because it was the first story that popped into my head, and also I'd kind of assume that most people are familiar with it, at least a bit. Just as a small disclaimer, I'm not claiming that I wrote Jack and the Beanstalk. Obviously. A very bold claim to make. Basically, a reverse outline is a summary of the draft you've written. Go through what you have and write a 1-sentence summary of every major plot point. You can outline very broadly, just summarizing the most major points, like Jack sold his cow for some magic beans. The magic beans grew into a magic beanstalk. Jack climbed the beanstalk into a giant's lair, etc., etc. Or you can outline the plot more specifically. So, Jack and his mother's cow stopped producing milk. Jack's mother sent him to sell the cow. On his way to the town, Jack met a traveling merchant, etc., etc. It really just depends on the kind of editing that you need to do. You can do this all on one sheet of paper, or you can put each plot point onto an individual note card, which you can then switch around or add new points into. You can also just outline an individual character's arc to separate them out from the rest of the story. Setting this up can be kind of tedious, but it really does give you a better handle on your plot and cuts out a lot of the extraneous information. I think that the final reason why every stage of editing can be really difficult is because it's very easy to cross the line from constructively trying to improve your work to just unnecessarily harsh self-critique. This can be especially likely when other people's opinions are involved and that extra fun, sneaky ADHD symptom, rejection-sensitive dysphoria, can rear its head. For those of you who don't know, RSD is an ADHD symptom that presents as an extreme, visceral, negative reaction to any kind of perceived rejection. If you don't have a healthy attitude towards criticism, hearing any kind of feedback can be really difficult, and it can make you either reluctant to share with anyone at all or just lose a lot of confidence in your work. Editing inherently requires you to look for your own errors, and if you have a condition that affects your ability to regulate your emotions, like ADHD does for instance, then it's very easy to jump from too many geese in this metaphor to I should just burn this whole notebook and never touch pen ever again for the sake of humanity. The solution to this is a lot easier said than done, and I don't want to seem like I'm minimizing the issue. I just can't solve it in a video this short. But basically, you need to reframe your attitude towards criticism. Like I said, this is a lot easier said than done, and it will take years of, professional help, but all writers will still always have that moment where they want to just throw their whole project out the window because we're dramatic creatures by nature. Next time you're editing, try to remember that you're not just finding mistakes, but you're making improvements. Don't just focus on the errors, but on what you're putting in their place. Editing is about getting better. You took something out of your brain and you turned it into something that exists in the real world. Of course, it's not going to translate perfectly on the first try. Editing isn't about the bad things in your work, it's about making more good things. As always, I'm going to give a little recap of all the information I gave you this video. Number 1, when you're copy editing, get someone else to help you. Number 2, when you're line editing, try and get some space from the project before you go back to do your edits, but not so much time away that you forget it exists. Number 3, when you're doing structural edits, try reverse outlining to cut back on as much of the extraneous information as you can. Number 4, at all stages of editing, don't be too hard on yourself. Focus on the improvements that you're making rather than the errors that you're finding. That is all for this week's episode of JayDHD. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this helped you in some small way. If you have any alternate techniques that you'd like to let us know about, just say something in the comments. Next week, we will be talking about finishing projects, and poetically, that will be the last episode of JayDHD for a little while. Hopefully, I'll continue making these, but that is the end of my university project. I'll also be leaving a little writing prompt at the end of the video, as always. I'd love it if you would respond to that, either comments or email. I hope you have a great week, and goodbye. Is a summary of the draft you've already. Meep. Sound like a character from In the Night Garden. I'm in pain.